My name is Ashley Smith, and I'm going to be talking about Sidman Chapter 18, which is positive reinforcement in institutions. So he starts saying that people who we deem a threat to themselves or society, we commit them to institutions. We limit their social relationships, deprive them of freedom, of movement, and opportunities for decision making, and we forbid them from enjoyable things outside. We justify these institutional commitments as instruments for benefits of change. He goes on to kind of list out each form of institutionalization. He says schools for the handicapped are supposed to teach people how to overcome their limitations. Not the case often. Hospitals for mental illness, the mental illness population, are supposed to cure them. Again, often not the case. And correctional institutions are to rehabilitate. And again, he says that that is often not the case. He goes into the first subheader, which is institutionalized coercion, and he starts off by saying these institutions are often located in relatively unpopulated, far off, hard to get to areas, and this is indicative of what we are planning to do, or what our hopes for the people who are going to reside in these institutions. He said this is used for the people who we see are deemed unfit. He uses the word retarded, insane, or criminal, and he also says out of sight, out of mind. He then goes on to call out the helping professionals, which include nurses, physicians, behavior analysts, physical therapists, psychiatrists, social workers, correctional officers, and he says they all wash their hands of these problems. He says it's a grand avoidance reaction by the community. He said coercion is often a technique used that benefits the staff rather than the residents there, and it is used to get residents to behave. So after that, he goes into the subheader of misuse of deprivation. Deprivation is basically described as taking something away from someone so that it can be returned when the person who is in control of the authority figure sees fit, contingent upon something. So he says this is used by authority figures. There was a prison project, and this is on page 256, a prison project that Sidman says was completely coercive. And it was based on socially imposed deprivations and on avoidance and escape that deprivations generate. So on page 256 in your book, about halfway down the page, it just talks about what kind of happened in that study. It says that they impose solitary confinement on inmates and then let them out for short periods of time. If they show proper, if they behave properly, they deprived them of food and then handed them mere morsels. If they acted subserviently, they denied them of privacy and then gave them a few moments by themselves. If they had not been engaging in suspicious social interactions with other prisoners, they gave them menial jobs and then switched them to more desirable work details if they behaved with little resistance. And then with any lapse or real perceived like if they messed up, they would then yank these things from them, and the whole cycle would start again. Sidman then says punishment by shocks or deprivation makes escape reinforcing. Deprivation may keep orderliness temporarily, but the long-term effects are negative. Like there's nothing good that comes from it. Deprivation can contribute to the effectiveness of positive reinforcement, though. It makes reinforcers stronger. Sidman goes on to say interest in food is low right after you eat, but as time increases, that becomes deprivation increases as well, kind of like motivating operations. And I felt like he was kind of scolding people when he says it doesn't take extra effort to find reinforcers that are effective without the additional use of deprivation. Then on page 257, about the second paragraph, he said, in certain cases, deprivation for a brief period of time can produce desirable consequences that are unavailable any other way. After everyone has given up, you can still set a child with retardation on the road to effective learning. First, make her hungry, then use food as a reinforcer for some basic behaviors like self-feeding and following simple instructions. Once a child has learned those, you can develop other reinforcers and discontinue food deprivation. These are Sidman's words. He then goes on to say, even in those situations, only use deprivation to enhance the attractiveness of a positive reinforcer, not to punish unsatisfactory behavior. Again, he's saying this alone is not your punishment. This is used to enhance or add to. Once the individual learns the adaptive behavior you're trying to teach, Sidman says that you quickly end deprivation. He goes on to list some deprivations, taking away food, privileges, rights to give, or rights. Then he says, then giving them back when you see good behavior, then taking them and then giving them back. Kind of like a cycle. It undermines the teaching of positive reinforcement. So if you're dealing with behaviors that are up and down, up and down, up and down, if you take things and then give them back, take and give them back based on behavior, he said that undermines the teachings of positive reinforcement. Anyone who uses deprivation in this way, you can most definitely expect the people that you are depriving, or he calls them controllees, to rebel against you. And he goes on to say this is called counter control. He then says that naturally occurring deprivations such as food, sex, and other biologically occurring deprivations are okay to use. The MR or MI populations are only sensitive to a small number of reinforcers, and food being the most positive. So I feel like he was kind of going back to his example with the little girl, I believe, on page 256, where he was saying temporary deprivations, once the adaptive skill is learned, then you quickly end the deprivation. And he said with the MR and MI population, using food as a positive reinforcer, it makes things possible, like taking them to the cafeteria or taking them out to a restaurant. It also opens up a whole world of different contingencies, and it also it also it allows you to like it allows them to access or learn about delayed gratification. He then talks about timeouts and its abuses. He said this is a controversial form of punishment in institutions as well as homes. And anybody with kids knows that use timeout. He says the form of social control or deprivation is a coercive technique. Withdrawal of positive reinforcement, and he describes it as physically removing someone from an environment that has been positively reinforced, that was making positive reinforcement available, and putting them in an environment where there's little to no positive reinforcement available. He gives the example of a child in a timeout chair. He notes that timeouts cause little to no pain, so it is referred to as a benign punishment. But he then quickly says that this is the same reasoning used when people justify using drugs rather than restraining agents or immobilizing agents. If people or if patients and institutions are uncooperative. So I guess it's kind of a catch-22 kind of thing. When you use timeouts, it puts into the learning of the colleagues or whoever you're being coercive towards, and you can expect avoidance and escape. I thought this was really good. Sidman goes on to say that careful planning and positive reinforcement, children who were written off as being unteachable have turned into learners. So basically saying that through planning and reinforcement, anybody can learn, or positive reinforcement, anybody can learn. And the final section is prisons and learning environments. Youth in schools and homes have impoverished repertoires. They can't read, write, or calculate numerically. Basically the only thing that they care about is food, sex, alcohol, money, and being reformed. The only way they're going to be reformed is how to learn to not get caught again, and coercion has little effect on them. Criminality has many roots, but it's still considered behavior nonetheless, and we need to account for it. Most education programs in prisons have failed because they relied on coercion. H.L. Cohen and his colleagues did a study, A New Learning Environment, and it basically paid prisoners to learn, and that was their work detail. And the detainees basically they begin to buy classes and books and a quiet dormitory to live in and desk and just all kinds of things just from going to school. So I thought that was neat. It was shown that fewer of the kids who engaged in this study returned to prison. So it was really effective. And that is all, guys. That is all of chapter 18. Bye.